Hello and welcome to part 4 of CaliBunga, Tech, Drugs, and Capitalist Soul. So, you'll know by now, as you're one of our dear subscribers, and thank you very much by the way, hope you're liking our bonus content, do let us know, always happy to get thoughts and feedback and so on. So as I was saying, this is Auf Hibunga Bunga's multi-part series on the Californian Ideology. George Hoare and myself, Alex Hochuli, were in California in May 2019, thanks to the School of Humanities at the University of California, Irvine, to record sessions with the States of Wellness Research Group, who are critiquing the ideology of wellness today. So thank you to them and to Catherine Liu for sponsoring our trip. Parts 1 and 2, as you'll know, focused on questions of mental health, wellness, and drugs in contemporary capitalism. Part 3 looked more at the Californian reality and its relation to the Californian ideology, so we were talking about the built environment and geographic and social mobility. Now we're going to zoom out a little bit. While in California, we sat down with Tyrus Miller to talk about the Frankfurt School, the Humanities, and romantic anti-capitalism. Tyrus Miller is the Dean of the School of Humanities at the University of California, Irvine, an expert in critical theory, the Frankfurt School, and Georgi Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist philosopher. So why is all this relevant to the Californian ideology? Well, as you'll see, much of this pertains to one's vision of modernity. You can imagine two competing strands over the past 200 years, rationalism versus romanticism. In a way, the 60s California hippies represented romanticism in a way, an attempt to re-enchant a disillusioned world. But as that spirit became incorporated into market dynamics, it became rationalized. The stuff we talked about in parts 1 and 2 of CaliBunga testify to this. So to start off, here's George, Catherine Liu, and myself, Alex Hochuli, talking to Tyrus Miller in Irvine, California.
So I originally got introduced to Lukács when I was an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins in the 1980s, and I was reading Marxist theory, and he's a crucial figure in the history of Marxism, especially for the book History and Class Consciousness. In the early 1920s, it influenced a whole group of people from the Frankfurt School thinkers like Adorno and Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, starting in the 1930s or late 20s, and then also had a big resurgence of interest in that early work in the 1960s and 70s with the New Left. So that's really was my starting point, and it's interesting as a starting point because I think a lot of the English language and more generally Western reception of Lukács has been focused on actually what was a pretty exceptional work in his very, very long corpus of work and political activity. I mean, he had over 50 years as a mature theorist, writing even as a Marxist, and he also had a pre-Marxist career as a literary critic, as a philosopher. And I started to dig further into this work, and that meant also digging into the history of the 1930s and the exile in the Soviet Union and Stalinism and the return from exile to Eastern Europe in after World War II. And there's a really interesting and really diverse body of work that Lukács produces all the way up to the end of his life in 1971, and where he was actually working on a book that he didn't complete and didn't publish. He was dying of cancer at that point, but on the question of democratization in socialist countries, and it was in his response to the Prague Spring uprising. So there's a remarkable body of work that in some ways kind of puts history and class consciousness in perspective with a whole number of other interventions that he's making into really the major political events of our century, from the Stalinist show trials of the 1930s to the defeat of fascism, in the 1940s to the 1956 uprising, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in the 60s.
Because he lived through all of them. He had another 50 years after History and Class Consciousness still to go. So what ideas of his do you find particularly useful in your work?
So I think one thing that does connect the early work, but also takes on a different inflection in the later work, is a very strong emphasis that he puts on activity, public activity and collective activity, but as a framework for thinking and also for cultural and literary creation. So what I mean by that is he suggests that the active perspective, and he's drawing from very classical sources, Aristotle, the idea of sort of the active life, public life in the polis, as being a precondition for a certain kind of thinking that he believes also then allows a kind of translation into progressive thought and to engagement with the democratic and socialist political movements of the period. So what's interesting for me is the idea of this conditioning of thought and also of cultural production of literary perspective by the kinds of public engagement. And what I saw in the later work, and this is in particular when he returns from the Soviet Union, where he's been all of the war, he returns to Hungary in 1945. The Red Army is occupying Hungary, but there hasn't yet been imposed what would happen around 1949, which is sort of full-scale satellite Soviet bloc dictatorship. And he's thinking very seriously about what is it that we need in order not to regress back into fascism, to move forward with a kind of democratization, and what forms will this democracy take that's different from the parliamentary democracies of the West. And so there is this term of people's democracy, and that has come to be almost a kind of word for little Stalinisms in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. But at the time, it had a kind of actuality. It was a real problem to think through. And Lukács had returned from the Soviet Union, and he was suddenly the most famous public intellectual on the left in Hungary, and he was being asked for all kinds of occasions, to speak and to pronounce about the refounding of the literary society. What should be the repertoire of workers' theaters, of all kinds of these sorts of very practical questions. And he's thinking through what sort of culture will cultivate the habits of mind and the connection to public engagement that we need for a post-fascist democracy in transition, maybe over the long term to socialism, but not yet, kind of imposing a Soviet-style socialist culture and political system.
So you mentioned his return to Hungary, and you were talking just before we started that you go there regularly. What's Lukács's reputation at the moment, do you think, in Hungary, and maybe more widely? Because I don't think he's the most well-known Marxist thinker. I don't really fully understand why his reputation seems to have suffered or fallen away in the past sort of maybe 50 years.
So right now he is kind of almost state proscribed, but in the sort of soft repression way that the Orbán regime works. There are legal reasons why they can't simply disappear the archive, which is in the apartment that he formerly occupied. There was a sort of contract with the state that this collection would go to the Hungarian Academy, but it had to stay in place. So they took the measure of basically removing all the librarians that were attached to the Lukács archive, which meant effectively that no one can visit it. It's not closed. It's not dissolved, but it's effectively. But I started going there in 2001. I was a education abroad program director in Budapest, and one of our faculty took me there for the first time, and he was saying, well, Lukács, I used to read him a lot, but I've never been to the archive, so I'll come with you. And it was a kind of sad little place. I mean, you're actually in his apartment, and you're surrounded by his library up on the shelves, which is just one set after another of classic literary works in the original language, complete edition of Balzac, complete edition of Tolstoy, complete edition of Goethe and Schiller, and so forth.
Wow.
And you're sitting at his desk, reading the materials that you're requesting. But there was virtually nobody there. And I, with a certain reverence, was saying, well, could I make photocopies? And they said, you could copy everything that you want, but you have to bring your own ream of paper. And you went in the kitchen where the Xerox machine was and made your photocopies. So it was, there was already a kind of, sign of, on the one hand, everybody knew who Lukács was, and there were a couple of statues which have since been removed from the city of Budapest, but he was a neglected figure then. If anything, the government's crackdown on him, and probably more importantly on some of his still surviving followers like Agnes Heller, where they tried to take certain kinds of legal actions against her, probably to some extent has re-raised the profile of Lukács, certainly has created a bit of international outcry, and to some extent also has revived some of the interest of the contemporary art world for this contradictory and complicated figure who certainly wouldn't have been a fan of contemporary art, but nevertheless is seen as a really interesting figure to come to grips with.
Just maybe a final question on his. So I don't know if this is actually true or not, but I've heard a story that he planned at one point to write an aesthetics of film, but he wasn't a film fan at all. But he said, I've seen one film, and from this one film, a bit like Aristotle apparently, who didn't like theatre. But I guess have you heard this same story? And second, maybe more generally, what should we read from Lukács? What should we go and think through with Lukács? Because you've got to narrow it down, because he's got 20 odd books, and some of them are just long and difficult.
Yeah, and especially in terms of thinking politically today, I guess that would be the question, especially for the listeners of our podcast.
Yeah. So on the question of the film aesthetics, he actually did write one of the really early film essays on an aesthetic of film. So it's an actual text from about 1911. And he was very involved in drama. And the primary concern is to set film apart from drama, but in a way that's very perceptive, in which he wants to discern what are the characteristics of the film and how to define those in ways that then allows him also to get at what's distinctive about the question of the presence of the body and the flow of time in drama versus that in film. So he did actually engage in a I don't know how many films he saw, but he did engage enough to really actually be able to make some pretty perceptive remarks. And then he wrote a very long, it's a 1,600 page aesthetics towards the end of his life in the 1960s. One of my former graduate students has actually translated that, and the first volume should be published in the next year or two. But he also returned to the question of film in that, because that's all about the system of the arts and the film as kind of one of the branches of the system of the arts. So what should you read of Lukács? Well, definitely history and class consciousness. There's no getting around that, even though I do argue that it's somewhat
atypical.
Atypical. Also, the theory of the novel is, it's really a classic book. But I think the other two things that I really think about a lot with Lukács is the book that's called The Meaning of Contemporary Realism. It's kind of notorious because it sort of sets Thomas Mann against Franz Kafka, and Kafka, while he sort of says, yes, of course Kafka was a literary genius, but here's all the reasons why Kafka was bad, or his worldview is bad. And most people don't really go beyond that, but that is a book, coming back to the question of activism, where Lukács is, first of all, it's in the thaw right before the 1956 revolution. It's after the death of Stalin. It's after Khrushchev's speech. And Lukács is again thinking about, okay, in this post-Stalinist era of socialism, what should politics and what should culture look like? And his biggest concern is the question of war and peace, and particularly nuclear war. So he de-emphasizes really the class-on-class class struggle, and he asks the question, in this framework of culture, in what ways can we cultivate an activism that will allow us to not move towards a nuclear war? And it's in the context of the anti-nuclear war, the anti-nuclear movement, and so forth, that was part of that politics of the 1950s and the nuclear disarmament campaigns and so forth that continued really all the way into my memory and into the 1980s. So there is a there is a connection there with some of what I at least consider to be almost the genealogy of, for people that have a kind of a longer memory, this was the genealogy of some of the political movements that we ourselves participated in as young people, and that either have not borne fruit or else continue in various sorts of forms on the left.
Because it makes me think Perry Anderson's classification, I guess, of the whole of Western Marxism as coming out of defeat. I guess, are we in a somewhat similar position at the moment? The left has been defeated, and maybe this particularly applies to history and class consciousness, but I guess this is, drawing out Alex's question a bit as well. What political lessons can we learn? Is there anything that we can take from perhaps particularly Lukács's earlier work that's applicable to what we need to do now to kind of, I guess, build a common leftist project?
So, I don't know that I would solely say defeat, although it definitely is an element of this, but I think Lukács is in many ways a thinker of the slowness of the path to socialism. He had almost messianic expectations, in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and which is embodied theoretically in history and class consciousness. And much of the rest of his work is a coming to terms with how do you hold on to the hope and at least the faith, because hope might be a little too strong, but the faith that there is a socialism that is coming, and what are the steps that need to be taken, but also how do you understand the patience that is involved in suffering various sorts of defeats but also continuing to move forward. And there's a really interesting moment in one of his essays on Tolstoy, which he sees, also in some ways as a thinker of kind of the prematurity of the Russian Revolution and some of the kinds of ways in which Tolstoy is figuring. But he has this, he quotes this famous quote from Marx of hic Rhodus, hic salta, here's roads, here leap or dance. And the idea up for Marx was, this is the place where you need to engage in the socialist struggles of the present. And Lukács says something like, today we have to admit that Rhodes is a long way off. And I think his thought is very much tied up with the kinds of hopes that he had for an immediate world revolution that would transform everything and create a new man. Almost on the spot, by 1924, and then, living a very long life committed to socialism, but understanding that the time frame was being extended and pushed out. How do you begin to come to terms with that without losing the faith and the commitment that he had?
Yeah, challenge today.
So, and you mentioned, I think, the word conserving. And I think maybe this would be a good segue to talk about the humanities and how do you conserve the humanities, how do you extend the humanities.
How do you break them and start it over?
Well, perhaps as well. Maybe that's something to ponder. You mentioned Budapest. Obviously, there's the example there, which we've discussed on previous episodes about Hungary, actually, about the clampdown on academic freedom at the Central European University. where I live in Brazil, they are making very serious cuts to social sciences and humanities funding because it's, and this seems like a Cold War throwback, but they're seen as homes of leftism, and so, you know, what's the point? Why not? People should go study something that's productive, like engineering or medicine, instead of the humanities, which is useless. And then it's under attack in maybe less politically direct forms in the United States or in Great Britain, where, you know, the humanities are just simply devalued and much more instrumental knowledge is favored. So I guess, just as a starter, how do you defend the humanities today, and not just defend it in kind of guarantee funding, but how do you mount an intellectual defense of the value of the humanities?
I think of the humanities as the source of a number of traditions of thought that have been important in our criticizing the existing situation, and also that help us to imagine alternatives to things that we have criticized in the present and in our past. So I think it would be very unfortunate to jettison that in the name of whatever it might be, technology or market values and so forth. I think in a deeper sense, we as human beings have an engagement with the question of the meaning of what we do. And in essence, the humanities are the sciences of that meaningful dimension. And the key dimensions of meaning include our investigation of our histories, our capacities for imagination that go beyond the empirical positivistic aspects of present facts. So the ability to project ourselves imaginatively into alternative worlds and into the worlds of others than our immediate community.
So I thought I would push you there a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because you were, that was a very eloquent defense of the humanities, but is there the possibility that in the present state of a war of the 1% against the rest, if we accept that, and some leftists do, some don't, but if you think about the sort of destabilizing forces of capitalism and market values, and then this deep retrenchment into trying to preserve the status quo, how do you see the humanities there as a site of just to be protected, or as a site that can actually marshal forces of critique against the status quo?
Okay, so there's a couple things I want to say about that. I mean, I very much value the element of the humanities that are involved in critique, and I think that there are important resources there. So just to actually give you an example, as I was thinking about the question of Lukács and California, which is a somewhat unlikely conjunction, I really was beginning to think about this concept of reification that Lukács raises. And what's important about the concept of reification is it's a very innovative way of thinking beyond what Lukács inherited as the concept of ideology. Ideology being simply false consciousness, or even more crudely, bad ideas that are perhaps socially generated, but nevertheless it's a question of the ideas that you have in your head that are erroneous, are distorted, are bad. And Lukács was trying to get at the way in which thought was almost embedded into situations and was maybe experienced spontaneously and intuitively in ways that distortion was already built in. So even in some cases, you might be able to know the critique, to be able to consciously critique these, but nevertheless still be engaging in that systematically distorted thought insofar as you acted. If you think about the way in which I remember one time using the term mythic thinking, and one of my friends, in a sort of fit of pique said, mythic thinking, like, you mean the way that you interact with your car? The way that you take vitamins, these various sorts of things where, these are spontaneous acts where I can't defend the rationality of them, but I'm in some sense kind of embedded in that almost mythic interaction just by the way that we act with our everyday commodities and with our bodies and so forth.
This is relevant here. We're talking about the humanities and whether they can be sites of critique and imagination, away from the overbearing rationalization of social life today. That is, the drive to monitor and measure and encase and instrumentalize social relations. One relevant concept here is that of reification, that is, the thingification of social relations. We can think about this in relation to depression, as we discussed in part 2, for example, of how diagnostic categories of mental illness come to be seen as real, or in relation to Silicon Valley ideology, such that spirituality or wellness or care can be siphoned off into manageable chunks that make you more productive. Things that seem completely alien to questions of production or distribution or consumption suddenly become parts of the market. Tyrus here on algorithms.
When I was thinking about the question of the critical resources that the notion of reification gave, I started to think about a very California problem, which is the role that algorithms are playing in structuring our lives. And there's been a kind of critique of algorithms that say embedded in the very structure, the kind of ontology that algorithms have, where some beings are recognized and some aren't. Systematic bias, various kinds of social effects follow from that. I don't think that you get, I mean, yes, you can have a refined informatics and you can have a refined computer science that is attuned to some of those kinds of questions, but I don't think that you have a systematic framework for thinking about that kind of problem without the resources of the humanities, including the idea that this is a part of a long tradition and a long chain of transformations of processes of reification that Lukács developed. So that's the critique side. And this is a long-winded kind of answer about the question of the humanities. But I think there's also what I want to call the sort of exemplary side. There's the critique, and then there's what I would call the exemplary. And what I mean by the exemplary is the humanities help to stage certain kinds of forums, situations that are partially intellectual, but they're also partially experiential, where a different kind of relationship to truth and to the pursuit of truth can take place. And I think the humanities are particularly good at thinking about how to structure those, how to form those. Obviously, the arts and the experience of the arts are one example, but I actually think in the university, yes, the university can be a site of critique. So the university is an important site for criticism, because we are kind of we're the repository of a whole tradition of critical thinking of various sorts. But we're also a space where different kinds of conversations and different kinds of interactions can take place. There is, out of the Frankfurt School tradition, the work of Habermas, who talks about non-distorted communication. He's coming out of the 60s student movement, and he had various sorts of ways in which he unpersuasively tried to, root this in some kind of, almost transcendental nature of human language and so forth. But just in a pragmatic sense, the notion of a space where conversation and debate can take place with at least mitigated, limited distortion from hierarchy and power it's a good notion. Whether it's transcendentally grounded or whether it's just a kind of pragmatically good thing to do. And I think the university can be a space of that. And I think the humanities really are, because of the nature of our engagement with meaning, we're a key site where those sorts of exemplary conversations can take place.
Okay, but I guess there's a practical problem, which is humanities departments, faculties getting budgets cut, for example, whether that's in public or private institutions. And often the defense of the humanities, when it's made to whether it's administrators or to politicians, is that, well, no, but look, the humanities can be useful, and whatever instrumental notion that is put forward, that it'll actually lead to greater productivity, or whatever the ways that those arguments are couched, which tend to be self-undermining. They undermine the base, exactly what you've just been speaking about. So I guess, how do you negotiate that difficulty of, in very practical terms, needing to defend the humanities, that you need to defend budgets, for example, and without undercutting the very basis on which you make those arguments?
So, I think it's that these arguments have to be made on a number of fronts, and I don't think that the employment front is one that I would want to kind of completely dismiss. I think there were a lot of myths about the humanities that were put forward, particularly in the financial crisis, in which there was almost a prescriptive sense of the humanities should go down, and therefore let's find the arguments to make them go down. I had the experience of having a conversation with the director of a computer gaming program during this time, and he was saying the gaming industry won't hire our students out of our gaming program, but somebody with 3 or 4 years of industry experience can be can have a bidding war for them. Well, nobody was saying engineering is in crisis because undergraduates can't be hired in the midst of the financial crisis. But that was the argument about the humanities. And that situation, I think, is one where it is important to talk about the employment data and to talk about the kind of career paths. But there are deeper arguments for the humanities that also involve the plurality of values that we help to address. And financial value is really probably the weakest of those. And also it's the one that is least harmonizable with some of the important kind of critical thrust of the humanities. And I think that we have to really continue to own that, continue to articulate what's the value of that, while not neglecting some of these other dimensions for, at a minimum, pragmatic reasons. If we get our budgets cut and we can't do what we do, then all of that goes out the window, and we have to actually assure our base in the institution. That's another thing that I'll also say, that I think that we're becoming increasingly aware of the ambivalent role of institutions, but also the fragility of institutions. And as there's been more and more attack on institutions, on institutional norms, on law, we also recognize that that shouldn't be taken for granted. And I had it's not just really in the Trump era; it's also in a period where we could say, in a positive sense, there was protest in the university. I think back to 2009, when there were kind of a lot of occupations that were going on. But there was a kind of talk among some elements of the protest that was about, the university is no different from a prison, and let's tear it down, and so forth. And I was really disturbed by the resonance between, a kind of external, largely, right-wing or kind of neoliberal, let's, strip down the university, let's unbundle it, and, what was also being generated from the protest, where the question of the value of the institution and what actually would be worth preserving and even creating alliances with was not really on the table at that point.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you then, since we're in this context, then, if what you think about the arguments that that are argued from the conservative end of things, that I would take up from the left end of things, that says that because the humanities reneged on totality and universalism in favor of difference and pluralism, we no longer have meaningful things to say to people, because they were all about differences and identities, and this dissolution and fragmentation of a kind of total picture of knowledge or universal identifications or commonalities, like the grounds of both solidarity and Hegelianism, because we reneged on that in order to, in the post-68 era, is there some kind of rot from within that we need to look at from your point of view?
I don't think that the universalisms came apart because of some subjective failing of the left. I think that that actually is a set of objective social forces and tendencies that really probably needed to come apart. And the task is not so much to retrench on a kind of broken universalism, but to actually rethink the question of how solidarities across differences could be created. I'll give you one example where I actually think that I found it a provocative example, and it actually helped me to think through what was happening in some of Lukács's work, and it's around the question of populism. I spoke about people's democracy or popular democracy, and the constitution of a kind of notion of the people as a space where solidarity across differences could be constituted. In Lukács's case, it especially had to do with rural and urban populations, but it was really looking at the way in which the identification of a people with plural components could be the umbrella under which various kinds of democratic, plebeian, anti-fascist elements could be politically and culturally organized. And the question of populism is definitely back on the table, and I don't want to be uncritical or uncritically celebratory of those, but that seemed to me a positive example of the ways in which, without returning to the kind of Hegelian universalism of the imputed class, the imputed universal class of the proletariat that Lukács was aiming for in History and Class Consciousness, that nevertheless a sort of larger than merely local, parochial, fragmented, separatist, particularist identity could be articulated in ways that could contribute to a collective political project.
I guess I was thinking more of the universalism of the commodity, the universalism of the experience of the commodity, or even the universal fungibility of the notion of reification, which seems to be able to be applied, I think, in a very critical and totalizing way, in a positive totalizing way.
Now we turn to politics proper. The notion of populism, especially of left populism, as we've discussed on Alpha Bunga Bunga a number of times, is based on a coalition of different identities, rather than the figure of the universal worker. How does this all relate to class consciousness today?
I think that the emergence of new social movements and the emergence of the identification of new social agents in revolutionary left movements was in part confronting the inability, what do I want to say? That the notion of the worker wasn't actually providing that kind of universal identity that was posited by Marxist theory. Now, it doesn't mean that that labor or work or various forms of association with the work world don't provide important identity positions and motivations for political action. So it's not a question of eliding workers, but I think that the problem was that in various ways already in the 1960s and onward, the question of how binding the status of the worker as an identity really was. And I accept that there were serious questions that were raised about that, and serious questions not just on a theoretical level, but questions that were really raised about to what degree does that actually provide a kind of universal point of identification for the various agents that might be involved in a common political process.
Well, it's tricky because that Leninist move from trade union consciousness to political consciousness, not only, well, to the extent that it happened, it certainly isn't happening now. And in fact, we've retreated even from the trade union consciousness, right? That there's very little evidence of that basic sort of workerist consciousness. And so we're stuck in a situation where we're having to make a leap almost to political consciousness without that trade union consciousness. So it puts us in a difficult situation.
Although, there are new forms of activism that are, coming about in relation to new forms of work. So, I can't say yet because I haven't even heard, any kind of post-reporting about the Uber-Lyft strike. But that's a situation where gig workers who are by design atomized, algorithm, managed and so forth, are seeing across national boundaries ways in which the identification as workers and not independent contractors, is providing them a means of labor contestation. So that's a really interesting phenomenon, but it's not, it's not the Russian Social Democratic Party of 1900. Right. Or even the British, or even the British trade union, shop store movement of the 60s and 70s.
I want to offer like a counter version of the history to the history of the new social movements and the demise of the worker as the universal inflection point of identification. What about the idea that workers were the working class was gaining too much power in the United States, and that we had reached a point of stagnation with regard to profits by capital. So capital itself colluded with new social movements in this promotion of new identities to undermine working class power in the post-60s period, so that the worker no longer appears as a vanguard class, but both to the new left and to capital itself. And Jefferson Cowie's wrote a really great book on this called Staying Alive, The Last Days of the American Working Class, where it's not, so maybe the idea is not that the worker in the strict Lukácsian sense is the universal point of identification, but at least that class struggle is the sort of universal experience of history making and political struggle. And that was undermined by the emergence of these kinds of new identities, new social movements, and capital colluding to defeat a working class, to put an end to class struggle by undermining unions, undermining negotiations between bosses and workers, and by atomizing and niche marketing to proletariats and lumpen proletariats who are increasingly seeing their wages compressed and capital's incursions on its own profit margins increased. What about that version of history?
I'm skeptical. I don't want to say that there's no element of that, but I also think, and particularly when I think of the movements of the 60s, 50s and 60s on, the role of race in the United States, the questions of gender, the role of other oppressed ethnicities. And then from another side, also the kind of whole account of the changing nature of work, the stratification and professionalization of work. It seems too simplistic an account to say this was just a sort of strategy of the bosses to get people to buy into particularist identities so they could break union solidarity.
Or at least make unions look bad. Because you couldn't break the union solidarity, but you could say, well, women, of course, they're excluding you, differently gendered people. I understand what you're saying. I think intuitively I disagree with you, but we can have this exemplary discussion despite the fact that we disagree on this level.
But it's also, these were demands that were raised from within movements by, also by, union militants, by people that definitely were not, it's not to say that there couldn't be unintended consequences, but these were authentic expressions of their experience even within the labor movement, and also, going beyond the labor movement of racism and, various other sorts of oppression. And, this is a perennial kind of question that socialist and labor movements have grappled with, of how they relate to other forms of social oppression, whether these are simply a kind of expression of capitalism. But I think that trying to be too reducing of those forms of oppression and forms of experience that have generated the demands for alternative movements, alternative forms of organization, is really probably to replicate the set of problems that led to the fragmentation of the labor movement, rather than some sort of more positive confrontation with those sorts of differences.
So I don't think I'm being reductive here, because I do believe that private foundations managed to fund civil rights activists and create middle class movements in all of these levels. I think Gloria Steinem took over feminism and created bourgeois feminism as the face of feminism, eclipsing working class feminism. I think the same thing happened with the civil rights movement in the Ford's and Rockefeller foundations. I think there are real paths by which activists were rewarded by private foundations who became increasingly neoliberal, and these figures became the spokespeople for the movement, because I think Martin Luther King Jr. was moving towards socialism, but his legacy is increasingly seen as moral and superior. And what happened with feminism had to do with the bourgeoisification of feminism. So I beg to differ in reduction. I think I have historical knowledge on those things.
But there's an interesting point here about the moral critique of capitalism in general, which draws on a point that Alex wanted to make, a Lukácsian
point. Well, actually, I'm going to attempt a synthesis of all of this, and it's going to be really awkward, so bear with me.
Oh, thank you, because he's my boss. You better synthesize.
No, I'm gonna like clear my throat.
I'm ready for totality.
Yeah. No. So let's try this. So we've touched on post-60s new social movements and the new left. We've touched on the humanities perhaps as a repository of historical memory and historical thinking, and we've touched on Silicon Valley algorithms and things like that. And to try to bring this all together, so the Californian ideology, and in some ways maybe it could just be described also as the new spirit of capitalism. This is a term I actually sometimes prefer, but this confluence of hippie, new ageism, and hyper-capitalist, late capitalist perhaps, individualization, all mediated through new forms of technology. And Lukács talks about romantic anti-capitalism as a thread that runs through modernity, as the mirror to bourgeois rationality, and that it's always there, recurring, challenging the bourgeois society in the name of pre-capitalist values. And I guess we can see the 68ers, in some sense, attempting a form of romantic anti-capitalism. Not all of it wasn't total, but there were certain strands there, very obviously with New Age, but not only with New Age, but some return to kind of communitarian values, something that challenged the rigid, corporate-dominated kind of structure of work, the company man and all that. We live in a period today of eternal presentism, where we're disconnected from history, from the past, and from any future. So I guess my question is, to the extent that there's a sort of Californian ideology today, and whether it's spouted by Mark Zuckerberg or whoever else, it seems that what is missing increasingly even from that kind of body of thought, if we can describe it as such, is precisely that romantic element. That's been lost even. So even in the Californian ideology, the two components of the new spirit of capitalism, actually the romantic element only exists in the most aesthetic or superficial ways. So maybe, I don't know, if you agree with that characterization of things?
When you were talking about this, I was thinking of the very last episode of the show Mad Men has Don Draper, kind of working out at some sort of, yoga resort.
That's right, I'm glad you went there.
And you see him, with a look on his face, and it's profoundly ambiguous because it ends without any kind of comment, but you don't know if he's having, a sort of spiritual awakening, like, oh, I know that I've wasted my life and all this, frivolous stuff. But the strong implication is like he gets it, and he's going to be the genius of marketing, you know, for the next, you know, for the 1970s, where this is, you know, California is the vanguard of this kind of
new consumerism,
peddling of individuation. Or one of the things, you know, that I have really been interested in, both in the Frankfurt School and also in relation to Lukács, is certain ways in which their theory got repackaged, let's say, by particularly the 60s art world, but more generally a kind of, you know, countercultural movement where the idea of a kind of authenticity of experience and experimental nature of experience was a way of opposing the reification of a commoditized technological society. And, you know, in lots of ways I want to celebrate that countercultural and that neo-avant-garde exploration of alternative forms of being, of living, of, you know, experiencing. But I also see it's a profoundly ambiguous kind of thing where you can sort of see, again, you know, the look on their face, is this an awakening, or is this, you know, a way of projecting into, you know, the kind of much more cynical art market of, you know,
it's recuperated before you've even begun, maybe.
It's commodified before it even exists.
And I think that, you know, I guess the thing that I would want to say, and this might be, you know, a more surprising conclusion from all that, is I think that we have to actually push further into that ambiguousness, because I think that the core content of ultimately of Lukács' theory, which aesthetically is absolutely conservative, it's, you know, about great realism of the 19th century. You know, Marcuse is an interesting case because he was the hottest cultural critic in the 60s art world, but his actual art examples are much more Goethe and Beethoven than, you know, and he explicitly rejects kind of the living theater and so forth that were, you know, putatively applying his ideas. But I think that the content, and Adorno, who of course has very explicit connections with a certain kind of modernist avant-garde, particularly in music. But I think that all of them are really in some way circling around the question of what are the forces that are involved in individuation, what are the forces that are involved in a kind of subject formation that either can have a resistant and critical relationship to the social context, or are assimilated and administered by that context. And of course it's hardly an either or question. It's a dialectical both and. We all are administered, we all are in various ways in conformity with the structures of our society, and we all have the capacity to resist and to reflect. How do we set up a process where we are able to emphasize that individuation in positive ways, and also how are we
on a mass level?
But this is also where I don't think that these thinkers really got very far beyond thinking about it on the exemplary level. And I did talk about the importance of the exemplary. They are looking particularly to art. And I don't think for just the reasons of the Perry Anderson, you know, they sort of fail in politics and they look to aesthetics, but I think that they look to aesthetics as a kind of ground where you can see the exemplary processes, and it's hard then to translate that into, well, what does that mean on a mass scale or a collective scale?
Activist scale. I think Adorno said Marcel Proust was the last individual. It's not like that terrible.
So the issue today becomes how do you make that? How do you massify that? How do you spread it, make it truly popular?
Well, how do you adapt it to a current set of circumstances? Because we're not really, we're not dealing with, the rise of radio music, which exercised Adorno in the 30s and 40s. We're dealing with a much different set of circumstances. But that problem of a kind of exemplary individualization is still an issue, and I think that there's still theoretical work to do in that tradition that develops their legacy. But then something that really probably Lukács was the most activistic, but also the most contradictory in that actually existing socialism and the kinds of goals that he had, you know, he in various ways sometimes withdrew, sometimes accommodated to Stalinism, to Kadarism. But he was someone who had the most clear relationship to a collective politics. But I think none of them really give us very clear examples of how do you move from that exemplary domain to the generalization to a larger collective project. And I think that is probably the biggest gap theoretically that, you know, there's a lot of work for us to do.
That's great. I think we maybe finish there. I mean, the gap is a great place to end on.
Okay, that's it for part 4 of CaliBunga. We are back in a week talking to the Dutch film director Menna Laura Meyer about her documentary Now Something is Slowly Changing, about coaching and therapy culture today, and how the Californian ideology is now world culture. Also, here's a date for your diaries coming up very soon. On Saturday, 20th of July, we'll be doing our first live chat for subscribers. That's available to the influence peddling tier and upwards. We're going to be having a big debriefing and discussion about all that we've talked about in this series. Catherine Yu will also be joining us for it, so please do join us for that. And then on the 4th of August, our first Bunga reading group will take place, virtually, of course. We're discussing Nancy Fraser's The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born, from progressive neoliberalism to Trump and beyond. It is fortunately an extremely short book, so you definitely have time to read it by then. Please do send us any questions and points you have in advance. Really excited to be doing this and to be able to chat to you all then. That's it for now. Catch you next week. Bye bye.